Welcome to our discussion of intelligence, that very important topic that we may think drives many of the outcomes in our life. What is intelligence? How do we measure it? What are the different kinds of intelligence? We'll discuss all this and more today. Intelligence is one of the most important psychological traits or variables that we use. It is also one of the most controversial. The basic question of what is it and how can we measure it shows that we cannot disentangle what it is from how we've chosen to measure it. We know in many cases what we want to get at, but our measures do have limitations. As we'll find today, those limitations do not render it useless or unfair or discriminatory necessarily. They can, but not just by themselves using an intelligence test to make decisions about people. So we'll start with some history of the intelligence movement, especially in our country, the US. A lot has happened in the last 100 years, and we have a lot better measures and a lot more targeted ways to use intelligence. But when we discuss the benefits and challenges, we'll find that there's plenty of room to improve as well. But first, a quick true-false. It may seem counterintuitive. You would think that the longer an adopted child spends with his or her adoptive parents, the more similar their intelligence scores grow. But the opposite is true, as phrased here. As adopted children grow older, their IQ scores become more similar to their biological parents. This shows two things. First of all, that IQ has a very strong genetic component. And second of all, that there are different parts of childhood where this IQ gene structure seems to assert itself. More specifically, it seems to assert itself, the genes, more in later childhood and adolescence compared to early childhood and toddlerhood. This is generally true. There are some exceptions, but the general pattern is that Americans score better and better across the decades, called the Flynn effect. How are we to interpret this? Are Americans getting smarter, or are they getting better at taking tests? There's been a lot of ways to try and take apart this finding, take some measures out, re-standardize other measures, and it still generally holds up, which means we don't have a great understanding of why this effect is happening. If an intelligence test is a good intelligence test, it should not be much affected by coaching. And so many of the big name tests are very resistant to coaching. You may be able to bump your score up by 10 or maybe a max of 20 points, which is not nothing. It's substantial, but in the general scheme of things is not a huge effect. This is also true. It shows that there are gender differences on different ranges of the IQ spectrum. It also shows that the variability or spread outedness of the distribution of intelligence is different for males and females. Males tend to be spread out more, both on the low retarded end or the high gifted end, compared to females that bunch a little bit closer toward the center. The key word here is highly predictive, which makes this statement false. College grades can be somewhat predictive, but the correlation might be a 0.2. It's certainly not anything like a 0.5 or above, which I would consider to be a large correlation or highly predictive. This is a common belief in some circles that, like a savant syndrome, for example, you may be mentally retarded, but there's some gift intelligence-wise there to be unlocked. This is generally false. We find that those who are higher in IQ, closer to the genius range, experience better outcomes in many areas across developmental and success variables. The key concept we'll talk about today is the marshmallow test. Many of you have heard of this before, some of you in this very class. The general idea is something like self-control a part of intelligence or not? One thing we may think is that, yes, the ability to set a goal and meet it, to not get that marshmallow and eat it, so that you can get a later outcome or reward that is more valuable, 3 marshmallows, makes sense that pays off. And what we see, for example, is there's an environmental component to how does this self-concept develop? How does this, for example, resistance to temptation develop? Those who are raised in reliable environments clearly show a better marshmallow test performance. They're able to wait longer. We can also relate this to some problems that we see in children as they grow older. Self-control, but also delay of gratification. So can they delay the reward? And are they using optimal strategies while they're trying to delay gratification? We can tie this to an interesting variable, body mass index. We know obesity in children is a hugely important issue that seems to be getting worse in American children. And what we see is those that have both problems as they age tend to have the highest or the most dangerous body mass index. So what this means is we want to see good marshmallow test performance in our young children, and we know that one way to help develop that is through reliable environments. So sort of like intelligence, we know some things about how it forms, but there's still a lot more that we still need to learn about how it forms. But we do need to know it because later on in life we find out it's hugely important to many things that we care about. We can also talk about creativity. There is creativity and coming up with answers that other people don't come up with, but there's also the practical aspect. So in many cases, this is creative but not practical. How can we get something intelligent behavior that is both practical and creative? So let's talk about how the intelligence movement began and evolved. First of all, intelligence is different from an intelligence test. So the test, of course, is the measure, and it is an imperfect measure. Different tests have to provide evidence about how imperfect they are, and then you can use that evidence in terms of which test you want to go with if you're interested in measuring intelligence. The origins of this movement were by Alfred Binet, a French educator, came up with the idea of mental age. He was not using the term intelligence. His goal was to determine which students were falling behind. That was his main goal. Can I identify through some sort of test that some students who are 8 years old are not doing the tasks that a normal 8-year-old can do, so that we can use that score to get that child help? So mental age is what kind of things should a child of that age do? And you can see that somewhat similar to the idea of Jean Piaget in his cognitive stages of development. Now, Binet's idea was discovered, quote unquote, by Louis Terman at Stanford University, and he created what we often think of as the first large-scale intelligence test. So called it the Stanford Binet, gave Binet some credit for being part of the origin of this. He also took this the next step. So remember, Binet was just trying to identify students who were falling behind, who needed help, with the idea that he could catch them up. He wasn't trying to order them in terms of smart and not smart. Terman, on the other hand, that's exactly what he was trying to do. He came up with this Terman's termites study. He went to the California school system, gave this intelligence test that he developed, picked out the very top performers, the top 5%, if I remember correctly, then gave that 5% the test again and picked out the top students from there. So you're picking out one or two out of every 1,000 students. And he predicted this intelligence measure, especially those who were high intelligence, would go on to become senators, would become CEOs, would become Supreme Court justices. What he found was that, yes, the people in his study that he selected, the highest of the high intelligence, tended to have happy, largely successful lives. The problem was they weren't the most successful. In fact, at least one person that Terman tested and decided was not smart enough ended up winning a Nobel Prize. So this goes to show that achievement is related to intelligence, but achievement is not only intelligence. What what Terman forgot to include was something like self-control or motivation, a more personality-based indicator of performance. However, Terman's real contribution beyond starting the intelligence test movement was also popularizing the idea of the IQ or intelligence quotient. So he started with Binet's idea of mental age and chronological age or actual age. And of course, if your mental age is higher, you are going to have a fraction or a ratio of greater than 1, multiply that by 100, and you're going to get a number higher than 100. Of course, if your mental age is lower than your actual age, you're an 8-year-old, but your mental age is 6, you then would have, for example, 0.75 times 100, a 75 IQ. So based on that simple formula, the average IQ is 100, and you can see just how far above determines just how gifted, or just how far below is just how retarded. Of course, IQ is much more complicated today. The idea stays the same, but there's lots more transformations, lots more variables to include, lots more specific problem weights. It gets complicated much beyond this simple formula. But the basic idea underlying it is similar. And now, of course, you can imagine the IQ industry is big and it's very profitable. And you can see Stanford Binet today has a lot of individual tools that might be used, lots of different ways to measure this basic idea of intelligence. Now, let's think about intelligence when it affects different demographic groups of people differently. Men versus women, black versus white, old versus young. What was the view in 1980 was the same pattern of scores when administered to different groups of people. This was a very strict definition of what could legally be called an unbiased standardized test. And so that was an actual problem because this, if you dig into the numbers, if you go into this general topic in more detail later on in your educational career, this would be very difficult to prove. This has been updated substantially in the past few decades, meaning that it is possible, for example, for whites and blacks and Asians, for example, to score on average at different levels, and for that not to be evidence of test bias or test discrimination. The key is if there's a correlation, and there should be a correlation between intelligence and some sort of outcome, is that correlation substantially different? And that seems to be our definition now. So for example, if the correlation between IQ and what level of work achievement you get to, how high of a promotion do you get to, if there's a correlation for that for a male sample, that correlation should also be there and about the same magnitude for a female sample. If the test predicts for males but does not for females, then that is what the evidence for a biased or discriminatory test would be today. And once again, to show that, of course, Terman's logic using mental age relative to chronological age makes sense for kids. Obviously, a 4-point difference, you're an 8-year-old with a mental age of 4, you're going to be severely retarded. But a 4-point difference in adulthood clearly does not look much different. This would be just slightly below average intelligence, which means, again, today's computations of IQ involve a lot more than the simple ratio we've covered. But now that we've talked about the testing, let's talk about the latent or not directly observable concept of what intelligence really is. Here's what we're trying to understand, but it's very difficult to measure. Intelligence tends to represent a whole lot of different things, and different researchers divide this into maybe 2 or 3 or 50 or 100 components, and there's a lot of debate. over how many ways to slice up intelligence. But one thing we can say is IQ is just a score on a test. IQ is only an imperfect reflection of your actual intelligence. Where does it come from? Our best estimates are that 50% environmental and 50% genetic, give or take. So here's our basic issues. Is intelligence singular or multiple? Is it culturally defined? Of course, people growing up in non-Western countries would have trouble doing some of the problems that we might have to for our exams. There are some supposedly culturally neutral intelligence tests out there. There may be situations where we'd want to use those. Also, there are some situations where they don't use tests. Some colleges where they hardly ever use tests. Of course, they have to balance that out with other work. Some students, given that option, might prefer the test. And of course, do smart people get the best of everything? It seems that on average, generally yes, but it's not a perfect predictor by any means. So let's answer the basic question of, are there multiple intelligences or one general intelligence? And the answer is yes, yes to both. How do we decide whether there is one thing or two things? Well, we can rely on theory, which has happened. Also, we can rely on what's called factor analysis. It's a statistical technique that takes a whole bunch of problems and runs simultaneous correlations to see which problems stick together. And not surprisingly, if you get a lot of addition problems correct, you're also likely to get a lot of subtraction problems correct. And when they all tend to clump to stick together in a factor, we can label that a math or quantitative literacy factor. Contrast that with the idea of general intelligence. There's one thing, and maybe there's some other multiple intelligence that you could break it out to, but they all feed from this general intelligence. And there's a lot of research to support that as well. So again, the research can be interpreted both ways. I think the better question is it one thing or multiple things? Is instead, in what situations should we look at a general intelligence measure? And in what situations is a multiple intelligence or targeted specific intelligence a better way to go? Sternberg created his influential or three-part theory of intelligence, and this seems to make a lot of sense conceptually and intuitively as well. We have the analytical intelligence. Of course, you can argue that most of the tests that we take may be skewed toward measuring analytical intelligence too much. Creative intelligence, however, is a little different, but we know it's important. How can we use existing knowledge in ways in which there is no right answer? We want the person to create the new right answer. Google, for example, is a company that really seems to set up a good environment for innovation, giving employees time on the clock to work on their own projects. And we can also see cultural differences. For example, the United States has a great culture of innovation. The problem is there are other cultures, China, but others, don't have a great culture for innovation. And so their tactic is to essentially steal the American innovation. So that leads to the question of, is creative intelligence somehow genetic, or is it somehow culturally affected? Is it how we raise our kids, or is it how Americans are different biologically from Chinese? And we don't know. I would lead more toward the environmental explanation personally. And then practical intelligence. So these are people who maybe don't do well in college or school, but they do well in specific contexts. The military might call this situational awareness. For example, you're placed in a new situation, a new combat situation in a country that you weren't raised in. How do you know how to get along? How do you identify who's an enemy, who's a friend? It's something you probably were never explicitly taught in many cases, but some people have more of it and more of this ability than others. So we need to consider practical intelligence as well. We can also break down thinking into how it works. One basic distinction is convergent thinking, where you have to converge on the one right answer, versus divergent thinking. So one example that's been used is list the number of things you can do with a brick. Some people come up with about 5 in a minute and just they get bogged down. Some people can come up with 20 or 30 ideas in a minute. And what this goes to show is, of course, our testing often focuses on convergent thinking, multiple choice test. But things like essay are also important because they can measure divergent thinking. And I think there's been good breakthroughs in recent testing to support divergent thinking. Of course, brainstorming would be divergent thinking, coming up with multiple solutions. The TV show Chopped, where you're given a bunch of ingredients that have probably never been put together in one dish before. Can you come up with a way divergently, there's no one right answer, to come up with something that's a good solution for those ingredients? What are some other ways that we can break down intelligence? Here is one basic breakdown. Your book also mentions Gardner, which says there might be in excess of 100 intelligences. And of course, no one wants to take an intelligence test where they're going to measure 100 different kinds of intelligences. So just from that, you can see there's a clear split between the practical and maybe the ideal measurement of intelligence. So of course, for a specific job, unless it involves some sort of music intelligence, we can acknowledge that it exists, but we don't need to test for it when we're hiring our employees, for example. For those of you who are familiar with The Onion, this is a sort of humorous take on the idea that some people want to overextend these multiple intelligences and then demand that they get represented in the classroom. And there's a very real debate between how do we take this literature of multiple intelligences and practically identify the ones that we need to, but having to draw the line somewhere. And I think I would draw the line before we get to specific techniques for nasal learners, for example. We also have the idea of if there are different intelligences that can represent a certain way that those people like to learn. So once again, do you have to then match them to a certain environment that emphasizes that specific way of learning? There's been a lot of pop culture stuff about learning styles, not so much in terms of controlled peer-reviewed studies. But we do take those that exist, and it shows very little evidence for the consideration of learning styles improving learning, which means that sometimes there's an attack in the way the classroom is set up, and it's very easy to overextend what we need to change if we're not paying attention to what the research says. Let's look at how we measure intelligence. We have one way of breaking down tests into two different goals. One is an aptitude test. This predicts your future performance. It represents your capacity to learn. So of course, if this test would be timed, how many of these kind of problems can you get right in a 10-minute window, for example? And let's say this is part of something like the SAT. You're not going to be doing these kind of things in college, or for example, these are graduate school exams. You're not going to be doing these problems in grad school. So why are they on the test? That's an indicator to decide who gets into grad school. It's because they do predict. They predict your ability to process information quickly. They predict your capacity to do well in, for example, law school or business school, for example, which means they're correlated. They have a strong correlation between high performance on this and high performance in law school or in an MBA program, for example. Sometimes we're not predicting what somebody can learn in the future, but we want to know what they already have learned. This is the example of an achievement test. So something at the end of the semester in this class and many other classes, we want to know, have you learned enough to earn a certain grade? And we have different cutoffs for those grades. Same thing goes for many licensing or credentialing, as well as driver's test. Can you drive well enough to show that you have achieved a level of learning that leads us to believe you can be a successful driver, for example? Of course, once we set a cutoff, there's some debates about, well, what if somebody just barely gets above the cutoff? Yes, they get their driver's license, but they're still not a good or safe driver. So there's plenty of debates that we can have about setting a cutoff for what level of achievement should represent successful or adequate achievement. I also wanted to introduce, as the book does, what is generally thought of as the gold standard for an intelligence test. This is called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. There's also one called the WISC, which is for children. This is often, depending on the year, the most widely used intelligence test, and it's broken down into verbal and nonverbal speed-based tasks. And as you can see, it involves lots of components, and typical administration involves somebody who is certified and trained to administer the test. So given that we're doing one-on-one meetings or assessments with somebody who's being paid to do them, the cost of getting this measure is expensive. So if you want the gold standard, you're going to have to pay for it. You can see some examples from older versions of the test. So some basic math reasoning, some schematic or idea concept-based assessment, some logic-based assessment, and of course we see here the digit span. I'm going to start saying some numbers, and I want you to say them in the exact order back to me. This is going to be, as we'll find out, a clear indicator of certain kinds of intelligence. Basically, what kind of working memory do you have? Those people who have a huge working memory, and some cases of people who test out as extreme geniuses, can remember all 50 states in a random order. Not only that, they might be able to recite them backwards perfectly. And that's where I think you can really see the difference between somebody who's smart versus somebody who has an abnormally high capacity for extremely intelligent behavior. There's also some examples pictorially as well. So here's the performance test. How quickly can you match these shapes to fit the shape given? Also, these sort of abstract number substitutions. The faster you can do these with the fewer mistakes will result in higher IQ performance. Here we see one piece of information used to answer the question of whether intelligence is more nature or more nurture. As you can imagine, the answer is both, and we don't know exactly which way the scales tip. We're still learning about it. This is generally supportive of that 50-50 nature-nurture breakdown. On the left, you can see identical twins reared together, same genes, same environment, correlations almost 0.9. We rarely see correlations that high in psychology, so it's a very strong effect. All the way to the right, we can see unrelated individuals reared together, so adoptive families with multiple adopted children. This is what the influence of maybe the shared environment can represent without similar genes. As we start to review, let's see how we're doing with our concepts. Capacity to learn to be a computer programmer. So potentially, it's not whether you know a certain language now, it's whether, if we hire you, you can learn a new language, computer language, in the future. And as you can imagine, this is an aptitude test, your capacity or ability to learn information in the future. So we have Susan, who got fewer answers correct, but Susan has a higher IQ score. Well, it has to be because Susan is younger, which means that when we can calculate an IQ score, it's not just the raw number of problems right, it's also relative to that person's age. Also, if you remember from the WAIS, it also has to deal with how fast the answers were completed. So lots of factors beyond just the raw number of problems right get folded into calculating any good IQ score. Which would be the example of a creativity test. I could actually see two answers. If we're just going for straight creativity, probably B would be the best. But also D could be a measure of perhaps practical creativity that we discussed earlier. Quick true false. Multiple choice, by definition, uses convergent. You are converging on the one right answer. This is also true. We can relate it to educational attainment, career attainment, income, socioeconomic status, many life satisfaction. So intelligence by itself, more of it is a good thing, but once again, it is not the only thing as well. I can't imagine what Binet would say today with total certainty, but my guess is he was not trying to create this environment of standardized testing, where we're testing kids perhaps multiple times every year to find out where they stand, and to use that information to decide which schools get funding and which schools don't. There's often the belief that if a student is immature or underperforming, you can hold them back a grade. This is generally false. Of course, there's some exceptions and some good reasons to do this, but it typically doesn't make the student perform a lot better later on. IQ scores, sometimes we view them as very stable, but they can change. They don't change drastically, although when we're young children, sometimes they may shift fairly wildly, showing that I have less faith in a strong measure of IQ for younger children, given that. Mental retardation is by definition below typically 70 IQ, but there are various degrees of mental retardation and thousands of causes perhaps of mental retardation. So just knowing that someone has an IQ that shows they are mentally retarded tells us almost nothing about how to help that person and what that person is capable of doing. Let's look at the example of intelligence in people applying for jobs. Schmidt and Hunter are two very influential researchers, partly because of what they showed with the content of intelligence testing and management fields, but also with coming up with this idea of meta-analysis, which takes a whole bunch of smaller studies and folds them all into one. And they came up with the playbook of how to do it with some other researchers as well. But for our purposes, look what we're seeing here. Their idea was, we know that independently, so just separate correlations, general mental ability or intelligence has the highest predictive value compared to any other tool that we might use to select or decide whether to hire an employee or not. It matters much more than personality. It matters much more than how responsible they are. Surprisingly, reference checks don't do that well. So their idea was, well, we know that these mental ability intelligence tests predict the best, but what happens when we start to combine them with other measures? So for example, when we take the general mental ability test, maybe measures more analytical intelligence, and then actually have them do a job tryout for a while, put those two together, and we get a nice combined correlation between those two, which of course that improves our prediction. We're going to hire fewer people who end up not being able to do the job. So here's the issue. If intelligence is the best predictor of future work performance, why use anything else? Well, if we just use intelligence testing, chances are we will make selection patterns that look discriminatory. We will hire more males or females, or too many or too few people of different racial ethnic statuses. So oftentimes you want to combine an intelligence test that by itself might be discriminatory with another measure that can tampen down or maybe even eliminate the discriminatory effects of an intelligence test. So just one example of how intelligence tests might be used in the practical applied world. But that's enough for now. Let's continue our discussion of these issues on the discussion boards. How has what we've talked about today affected how you view how this concept is used in society? Some people probably came into this thinking intelligence is a biased endeavor. Has that changed, or is it still the same, and why? How has intelligence affected your life? Do you think it was fair? Did you think it was fair before, and has your opinion changed? How can we make it better while still using it? We don't want to just throw it out. And also, what can we do in terms of better representing and using and integrating intelligence into our important environments, our schools, our work, for example? So looking forward to discussing all of this and more in the class discussions.